So welcome everyone to this special board meeting of the South Bay City Council of Governments. My name is Christian Horvath, your chair. Thank you for joining us tonight. This meeting really came about as a result of conversations that the board was having at our May board meeting and then our June steering committee meeting, especially around the topics of race relations, community policing, and everything that's going on as it relates to us as policymakers. So I appreciate all of you that have taken the time to join us tonight. I appreciate all the speakers and panelists and that are here with us, including our moderator. So what I'm going to do right now is just so we have plenty of time to get into this here, I'm just going to make brief introductions. If you would like to read the bios of each of our panelists, Jackie and staff have already put that into the chat window. So if you hit your participants button at the bottom of your screen or your chat button, it'll fly out to the side and you'll be able to download that and read about each of the panelists. So with that said, tonight is a dialogue, as I said, for elected officials on policing and public safety in the South Bay. Our moderator is Dr. Errol Southers. He'll be doing the full night. Our first panel is going to be on the role of police, community policing, and best practices and community expectations. And our four panelists tonight are joining us: Supervisor Janice Hahn, representing the 4th District, Shari Weaver from Harbor Interfaith, Dr. Joseph Lee, a therapist in Redondo Beach, and Chuck Lennon, who is with LA County's Department of Mental Health. So with that, Dr. Southers, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to thank the South Bay City's Council of Governments for hosting this important event. It is a timely conversation and a discussion that we do need to have. And I keep getting asked ever since George Floyd's murder, what brought us here? So we're going to talk about some things tonight that have to do with community policing, best practices, community expectations in this first panel. And I'm going to open it right up by asking, I'm going to put Supervisor Hahn on the spot to start with. And I'm going to ask you, Supervisor Hahn, what steps do you think need to be taken to restore confidence in all the citizens in the institutions of authority? And most importantly, to make police accountable. Because that's something that we can constantly hear as we talk about police reform.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be with everybody tonight. And I think what I've begun to realize recently is we do have different segments of our society that do public safety differently. And I talked a little bit about that as we talked about reimagining policing on our metro system. And I said, for a white single lady, for her, public safety means being armed law enforcement on the train. But for our Black and brown commuters, sometimes seeing an armed officer puts fear into them and not safety. So we sort of have different segments of our society that view law enforcement differently. Parts of my district in LA County love their sheriff's deputies and actually want to see more. And then there's other parts of the county who find their lives have been really oppressed and abused by law enforcement. So the first thing for me would to restore confidence with our citizens is certainly to have accountability and transparency within our law enforcement agencies. I think it's not enough just to have certain use of force policies codified in different law enforcement agencies, but we have to have a way that we hold police officers accountable to the citizen. Now, in LA County, we have a Citizen Oversight Committee. I'm a big believer in Citizen Oversight Committee. In the county, we've given them subpoena power, that they can actually subpoena the sheriff, they can subpoena documents, they can look at every use of force incident in LA County and demand answers. I wish more police departments throughout the county of Los Angeles. By the way, we have 46 separate police departments in the county of Los Angeles. I think all of them should have a citizens oversight committee where we really do have citizens who are paying attention to law enforcement. So that's what I would do.
And those are good points. I served on a citizen oversight committee when I was in Long Beach for a year, and it was quite effective. And I think it's a good thing. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Dr. Lee. You know, some of the things that the supervisor mentioned with regards to how people view the police on the metro could be important. And you're in the health issue, or I should say the health sector. What kinds of things are you hearing, and how do you think we can restore faith in a community, and especially in a community that we have, I won't say a significant number because I don't know the statistics, but we do have people who suffer from mental health issues. And how do we restore that faith?
Well, I think one of the ways I think the conversation is happening right now regarding law enforcement, and Supervisor Hahn brought this up, is that the experience between people who are white versus people who are Black versus people who are brown, Asian, it's not the same experience. And I think that this is one of the important things that we have to understand, that broadly, I don't think there's going to be any sort of overarching general policy that's going to work for everybody. And I think, you know, coming from mental health, this is one of the things that we experience as, let's say, a psychiatrist, as therapist. Many people can have the same diagnosis, let's say it's depression, but when I'm working with somebody, their individual story and experience of depression is quite different. And our approach to helping any given individual, depending on their story, actually really dictates how is the best way to serve or help that person. So I think that that's an important perspective. I appreciate that we're talking about race, because I think that actually has a lot to do with this conversation about restoring public trust. The other thing that I think that's happening right now is I think there is a common conversation and education about race that's a lot more in-depth and more nuanced. I think in this country, people have frequently aspired to a sort of version of colorblindness that says, you know, we're all the same, we're all humans. But I think that inadvertently, with best intentions, erases the differences that people experience in the context of race. I think one of the things that I think I'm hearing, and especially from people of color, clients of color of mine, is that they actually don't want the conversation around race to be colorblind. They want to be seen for their unique differences, their culture, their skin color, their identity that's connected to that. And so one of the ways in which race and racism is being talked about is that there's a difference between not being racist versus being anti-racist. And I think that this is an important part when we say Black Lives Matter and we're having these conversations. It would be helpful to know that our public officials, our police chiefs, and people in these roles are not just acknowledging that there's racial bias or things like that, but they would also have the vocabulary and the ability to communicate that they have a fundamental understanding of the conversation that the community is having about what it is to be anti-racist. So if I hear a mayor or a police chief talking, using the language of anti-racism as opposed to colorblindness, that will help me believe that some progress is actually being made regarding a perspective shift that I think is actually pretty important that's happening in the community. And I want to see that be reflected in public officials.
And Dr. Lee, I think you're absolutely right. I think that when people often hear Black Lives Matter, what they're hearing is whatever nationality I am doesn't matter. And it's not a zero-sum game. It really is to be acknowledged. And your point about being colorblind sort of suggests to a person that you don't see me. And I think you're right on with that. I'd like to move, again, the same question with regards to what steps can be taken to restore confidence in the citizens, the institutions, and ask Ms. Weaver, coming from the interfaith community, and now that we're in an era of COVID where people haven't been able to go to their houses of worship, they haven't been able to congregate with their friends. And one of the things we could always count on, even in good times and bad, was being able to worship together. And we can't do that right now. What are you hearing right now as it relates to trying to restore confidence and not being able to necessarily congregate the way we used to?
Well, I think for me, I'm actually a homeless service provider with Harbor Interfaith Services. And, you know, one of the things I've been around since the Watts riots. I've, you know, firsthand experience, you know, just being a very short distance from that, and just, you know, feeling the palpable anger at that time, and even then moving forward to the 1992 riots. But the one thing that I think is really different about, you know, these particular actions that are being taken right now is people of all colors need to be heard. I know it's centered around Black Lives Matters, but to the point where you talk about, you know, our ability because of COVID not to congregate, not to be able to socialize, and not be able to have, you know, these meaningful conversations that, you know, I believe people are really trying to find solutions to how do I live more comfortably, more safely in my community is one of the things that I think we all really miss right now. Even in the line of work that I do, I just, I miss not having, my peers in the field to count and bounce ideas off of, and how do we really address this thing? And there's one other thing that I think, I know we're not quite in that area yet, but even talking about how do we enhance current, police practices. I'm a former LA County deputy sheriff, and I can remember a time when empathy and sympathy were kind of void of the work that we do. We were more or less trained and taught that, everybody is kind of adversarial. Our cooling off period was to go and work in the jails, and I really think that we really need to look at, the growth that's taking over in law enforcement. Social policing and some of the engagement that I see now is really taking leaps and bounds. But are we where we need to be at yet? I think the short answer to that is no. So I think, having real heartfelt conversations, that is coming from the community itself, and really having law enforcement engage in that partnership towards, how do we do things differently? It is time to have those conversations.
And, those are good points. And I want to shift here because I'm glad you talked about doing things differently. And I would like to ask Mr. Lennon, as we talk about policing and reimagining policing, what resources, since you're in the county health department, what resources would be available as alternative ways to address some of the current ways that we do everything? The police get called for everything. I spent the majority of my career in three different law enforcement agencies, and the police get called for, the domestic violence as well as the barking dog. And so as we talk about changing things, what kinds of resources do you think might be available so we could reimagine policing?
Well, I just thank you again for the invitation to be with you this evening. Speaking for the Department of Mental Health and law enforcement, almost all of the communities where all of you live, the Department of Mental Health has clinicians working with law enforcement, specifically to challenge the stigma of mental illness and to help police officers recognize the various challenges that are just the same about race, but specific to persons with a severe and persistent mental illness who might be in a crisis, a 911 call. And when I go out with the officer, we try to engage the person to see what's the best course of action for them to get help. Excuse me. That being said, you can tell after all these years, my hair is white and short because it's a challenge just to break the stigma of mental illness, break the stigma of racism, systematic racism, and the challenge for law enforcement officers, let alone the community. I think a big part of it is going to be training, and that's also a part of helping them understand mental illness. It's not just me in the car with the officer, it's also training the officers, what is mental illness? How do you deal with the various cultural realities that influence and that are involved with mental illness? And what are the resources that are available in the various communities? And what are the stakeholders in the various communities that can help families and individuals who are dealing with mental illness? Those are all big challenges that we face.
Could I jump in on that a little bit?
I was coming to you next. Thank you, Supervisor.
And I think this is the part of the conversation that's happening now in the streets, in the boardrooms, with the voters, is how do we reimagine law enforcement? There are those who want us to completely defund our law enforcement. And I know for myself, I'm more interested in reimagining it. And at any given time before COVID-19, we had 5,000 people in our county jails who had mental health issues. And I think there's a collective agreement that those people do not need to be in jail. There has got to be a better answer. And I am totally in agreement with those who are saying, gee, we have allowed our police departments, our sheriff's departments to clean up every ill in our society. Every problem we have, we call 911. And I think we're realizing that an armed response sometimes is not the best response. But right now, the way our system's set up, you only have 911, whether it's someone having a mental health breakdown, or as you said, a barking dog, or or some other issue. So I've asked the county to look at two things. One, should we set up another number that people could call for a non-law enforcement response that would be specifically our mental health professionals? Or do we take the path where we could actually retrain our 911 operators and they could begin to triage, as is the case in some of our other states? I know in Oregon, there's a program called Cahoots, and the 911 officer is the one that decides, is it an armed law enforcement response, or is it a team of medic and crisis workers who can respond to a mental health crisis? And we need more mental health urgent cares, right? There's sometimes a person just needs to de-escalate in a nice, office with mauve walls and recliners and nice music, and de-escalate, and then we can begin to help them with their issues. But all we have right now is for them to be arrested and taken to jail, which is the wrong place and probably escalates all of their mental health issues so much quicker. So I really believe now's our moment. Now is our moment to reimagine how we respond to all those calls in our communities. And is there a better way to do that?
It's funny, Supervisor, as you were speaking, I was writing down triage policing, and I've always believed in that. I believe in a central dispatch location, and in a perfect world, we'd have everybody sitting there, and you'd send the appropriate resources to the problem. So maybe we'll get there as we try to reimagine this. But I want to move on to actually any one of the three of you. I'll go back to Dr. Lee. We always talk about community policing, and I'd like to know, how would you define community policing, and what are its benefits?
I think I was on a Redondo Beach sort of panel a couple of weeks ago, and community policing was one of the conversations we had with our panelists, including our local chief, who's here today as well. And so community policing is, building relationships in the community with police officers so that the ultimate sort of perception and relationships that the people of the community have with the police officers is experienced as a net positive, so that if there is any issue that you would call the police for some need, that it would sort of be like this net positive experience that you would have. I'm calling somebody who's going to help me. So I think that's sort of the basis, right? That the police and the citizens have this sort of like collaborative, positive, net positive relationship. I know it's a part of how, let's say, policing can be done maybe more easily in a sort of wealthy suburb, as opposed to policing done, let's say, in a large urban area with poverty, and where the police officers who live, the police officers who are of the force don't necessarily live in the community, and it's a lot easier if the police chief and the officers and the deputies are neighbors, right? And I think that facilitates community policing in the sense that the police are literally part of the community, that they live there as well. And so I think it says something about, it asks the question, community policing asks the question, can relationships, like actual human-to-human relationships, make a difference into how the community utilizes the police and how the police respond to ultimately help? It's a question, right? And and I think that community policing, one of the analogies that now that we're having this conversation is, I think community policing as an analogy would be kind of like remodeling your house, right? You kind of have lived with the house for a long time, you know what works, what doesn't, and then you decide you want to make some differences. And so it's a remodeling idea. Community policing is a remodeling idea. I think when we talk about reimagining policing, we're talking about, let's sell our property, let's take out all the equity, and let's go somewhere we've never been, and we'll design the plans from the ground up, which might have some elements of what policing has been, might have some elements of community policing, but kind of if you start from scratch, then we can also incorporate ideas that say, some things that police have always done, let's completely have them not do that at all, not have a ride along with a social worker and a police officer arriving at a mental health crisis, but actually have police not be involved whatsoever in any mental health crisis: domestic violence, neighbors hearing people arguing, concerns about, you know, somebody with mental illness having a manic episode in public or something like that. That would be not a remodeling idea, right? That would sort of be a tear down, take all your money, reinvest somewhere else. And so I just kind of also want to put community policing as an idea in the context of the thing that you brought up earlier, which is what would reimagining policing look like? One of the parts of reimagining policing would specifically be having police not be involved whatsoever in certain things that they have always been involved in. And I think mental health actually ends up being one of the easier ways that we can imagine that. There's other aspects as well, but I just kind of want to put that community policing idea in context as well.
And Dr. Lee, you raise a really interesting point that people often forget. And I'm really proud of the fact that I served in 2 local agencies, one in Santa Monica and one at LAX. And all the years I served in Santa Monica, I lived in the city. And when I served at LAX, I lived a mile away, and it does make a difference. It does. It is my community, and I was treated very differently, and I treated it very differently when I worked there. I think you're absolutely right. But I'd like to go to Ms. Weaver and ask her the same question. You know, how do you define community policing, and you know, what are some of the benefits, and does it actually reduce crime?
I really do think it is. It's kind of like having your neighbor engage with you when you're having those moments. And I know we've talked a lot about mental health, but I think the other area that we also need to address is, you know, drug addiction and substance abuse. I just think that there is a better way to treat those incidences. You know, like I said, I worked in custody for many, many years, and I just think, you know, recycling people in and out of the doors without actually, you know, treating the root cause doesn't make a lot of sense. But I know just in community policing in our area, one of the things that we've had the opportunity to do, which has been quite a blessing, is to really work with our senior lead officers from LAPD and the amazing relationship that we have with Redondo Beach PD. And I think, you know, as a homeless service provider and somebody that, you know, by virtue of that work deals a lot with people with mental health issues and substance abuse issues, is kind of that educational aha moment when we're working side by side. You know, how to engage people in a way that de-escalates the situation and actually offer options at that particular point instead of incarceration. And I think the beauty of that is, you know, how can we do more of that to really get people to a solution-driven area instead of, you know, kind of living in the problem and you've acted out, you've had some bad behavior, and your consequence today is just incarceration. I don't think that's kind of the avenue that we need to continue to drive down.
So, Mr. Lennon, I'm going to pose a question for you, and Mr. Lennon, I'm going to pose a question for you, and then the supervisor. And you know, we're here this evening because of race and policing and use of force. So, I'd like to ask you, being at the county Department of Health, what's the county or the state even doing to encourage or require departments to address use of force and even institutional bias, which leads to racism? Are there things that can be done? Are there things that, in fact, you were doing?
Sure. I can't speak for all the police departments for LA County in a specific way, maybe except for the Sheriff's Department and LAPD. I know we just talked, my boss Miriam Brown and I talked to the chief of police last week. They're all committed to the trainings that are offered by Post through Sacramento, the police officer standards and training. Each department has trainings about use of force, that type of thing. I think as Supervisor Hahn said before, the transparency and accountability, there's reports by most of the police departments with statistics about use of force. There's review panels, the Civilian Oversight Committee, the LAPD Police Commission. They're always looking at those statistics. They're asking, why is there anybody why do you need to use force at all? So there is training, but I'd be the first one to say, we probably don't have enough, that's for sure. And I'm not sure the community is aware of how police is trying to be accountable. So there's probably a better public service. Again, going back to community policing, it's moving away from them versus us. And I'm not pointing to me because I'm law enforcement, I'm a social worker, to where are we? And I'm part of your community, and I'm here to help, and I'm here to serve. I'm also here to protect you from the bad guys or the bad people? And how can we do this together? And not, as Supervisor Hahn said before, why are we calling the police to take care of the barking dogs and everything else? They'll be the first ones to agree with everything we're saying. They don't want to go on mental health calls. So I'm sure they're going to be working with us, that's for sure.
And Supervisor Hahn, before I get to you, Chuck brings up some good points. And with all due respect to someone who's been in law enforcement and who was an instructor at the academy, we train these people in a paramilitary way. They come out of those academies as warriors instead of guardians. And then when they act a certain way, we're almost surprised. So, what should we be doing to encourage departments to address the use of force? And then I'd like to ask you a two-part question. Do we see any areas that are ripe for assessing best practices that might be out there?
So one of the things, and I know a lot of the activists out there don't think that the Campaign Zero goes far enough. But I will say, I thought it was a good start. There are 8 recommendations from Campaign Zero, which has been studying use of force in police departments across the country. And their statistics show that if these 8 recommendations were incorporated in different police departments, that we really would see a decrease in the killing of unarmed of people. So really, to me, common sense things like, requiring officers to intervene when they're on the scene and they see another officer clearly doing something that's not appropriate. Prohibiting the use of strangleholds and chokeholds and the carotid restraints. Requiring officers to de-escalate the situation before they use force. Prohibiting officers from shooting at people in moving vehicles. Requiring more comprehensive reporting that make sure we know who's using the use of force. I asked our county sheriff's department, and our sheriff will be on the next panel, to look at our own use of force in the county sheriff's department and see whether or not we sort of align with this. As I told you earlier, we have 46 police departments in LA County, but I took it upon myself to get on a call with the mayors of the 9 cities just in my 4th supervisorial district who have their own police departments. And I asked them to get with their chiefs of police and look at their use of force policy within their own police department and see whether or not there was a way they could start incorporating this. It was so interesting to me, and I feel the same way. Many of us had never actually looked at the use of force policy in our particular law enforcement agencies. These mayors said it was a very interesting conversation they had with their chiefs. They never asked them about their use of force policy. Now, a lot of departments will say, we do all those, or we do some of those, or, but unless they're codified in policy, then there's no accountability. Because currently, many times we can't hold an officer accountable because they'll say, it was never written in our policy. I didn't know that we weren't supposed to do this. So I think you can start with that. And you know what, I was thinking on Metro, right? We have 3 different law enforcement agencies that police our trains and our buses, our rail. And we started saying, do we really need an armed officer to check fares? If you don't pay your fare, okay, that's not good, but do we need an armed response to that? We also thought, do we need an armed response to enforce code of conduct? Like take your feet off the seat, or, don't chew gum. So we began thinking, what about things like ambassadors who could ride the rails and do things like talk about the code of conduct and also talk about people paying their fares. So I believe we're all starting to reimagine sort of a gentler world out there where we can get the same results without having use of force or an armed response, because we know for a fact that just seeing an armed officer can escalate someone's mental health condition or that fear that causes people to try to escape or run from the situation. So I think it's, again, a great moment to start with use of force and then broaden on what kind of responses we want for some of these violations that we find in our society.
You know, you bring up several points. Number one, the issue of accountability. And I've always been concerned that chiefs are selected by councils and mayors. And are they selecting the best person? Are they holding that chief accountable? But more importantly, to your last set of comments about metrics and data. And so do we know what the best practices are? Do we know what trends and patterns we have that actually work? So I'm going to go to Dr. Lee to ask you, you know, being in your profession, are there some best practices out there that you see as we talk about force and race and other issues that we might learn from and be able to share with each other?
Yeah, so I think, you know, so my day-to-day job is a therapist, but I also actually speak frequently, and my most common audience is to parents. And one of the things we talk about in the parenting world is a difference between intrinsic motivation, which is motivation that comes from within, and external motivation. And external motivation is basically a system of rewards and punishments. Or on the punishment side, it could be the threat of punishment. And so I think this speaks to something about like the idea of what happens when somebody shows up in a uniform armed, is that it becomes a very externalized scenario where the person who is now reacting, right? The police have arrived, the person who's reacting, they're reacting now to a threat or a perceived threat. And because the police officer is there, the threat is, am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to get arrested or something like that? And that absolutely changes the behavior of the individual. In the same way that we talk about if parents show up and they start, for the most part, threatening kids right off the bat, or they have a history with that parent who is very domineering, who has, you know, spanked them or something like that, then the kid almost automatically, regardless of what they've done, their behavior becomes completely oriented to not getting in trouble. It does not matter anymore what has happened. And so that same human behavior, whether we're talking a parent-child interaction where the parent has power and is aggressive and has a history, is the same dynamic that happens in the context of an armed police officer showing up in uniform in any situation. And if we're talking about the differences in race, you know, either that individual personal experience, or they have close friends and relatives who have had negative experiences that they can relate to, then that says, okay, I'm in trouble, I'm going to get in trouble, including, and this is just like children, including even if I haven't done anything wrong, I don't know how this other person is going to treat me, and I might get in trouble. And then again, that affects their behavior. So I think that's something in the context of psychology that can be helpful to understand why, you know, just the presence of armed police officers in all these situations, and I appreciate Supervisor Hahn bringing up all these other scenarios that have already been looked at, saying, is that really necessary? And does that change the dynamic of having a police officer involved? The other one I want to speak to is, you know, people are saying that one of the things they want to do is to have officers themselves intervene against other officers. And I just want to speak to how impossibly difficult this idea is, that you would have a human being in an in-group belonging, wearing the same form as this other person, to then change their mindset and do something to intervene against their sort of like co-officer, right? It's interesting, we have this parallel phenomenon happening right now where people can walk around saying, here are my beliefs about coronavirus, here are my beliefs about what is safe and not safe. And then you're seeing what happens as people are testing the waters of social gatherings. They're finally seeing their friends, they're finally seeing their family. And there is a human compulsion to kind of do what other people are doing in the group in which you belong. And it doesn't matter what your personal convictions are. It doesn't matter. In that moment, there are all these psychological experiments done that it is such a strong human compulsion to go along with a group. And if your alliance is with other police officers and your co-police officers, we're always asking these questions, why didn't that officer intervene? How come that other officer just stood there? Why? Because we're asking officers to do something that is a very, very difficult human thing to do, which is to go against what their group is doing. And then for them to do this, and then on top of that, you know, we know just things about group culture, to go against your group is a threat of being excluded from that group. And this is, you know, it's hardwired into us. So I just want to bring that point up because I know this becomes where, you know, police officers or people say, you know, no one hates a bad cop more than a good cop. except you're all cops. And I just want to point out that that is a hard ask to ask people to go against. And it's not safe if we codify or put it into rules that, there's a duty to intervene, sure, but in practice, right? And look, this is what psychotherapists do all day long, knows what the right thing to do is in the context of therapy. That's not why people come to therapy. It's a lifelong process to really change what you know, the healthy thing, the best thing, and to change that into real permanent change in human behavior. That takes a really long time. And it changes, and in groups, it would require culture change, a fundamental culture change for that to happen. And I'm saying that just knowing what I know, it's a completely unrealistic ask to codify a policy and expect results by saying duty to intervene. I just know that this is not going to work with real people.
Except for if we do have body cams, and I have just been witnessing a couple of videos where it was clear that another deputy should have intervened. So if it's codified and there's a body cam, then you can hold them accountable. And I think that's how we started this Zoom meeting off, is how do we restore trust? And there has to be some accountability and transparency. And I agree with you. I'm all for a cultural shift. But in the meantime, I want this accountability to be something that we can point to and said, no, you had a duty to intervene and you didn't. So you're also going to be held accountable for what happened.
And Supervisor, you're absolutely right. And I want to make a comment about your comment and Dr. Lee's comment. If I could go back as to the reason we're here, Minneapolis Police Department should have been the poster child for reform. They had an indigenous, openly gay female chief who I knew, I thought she was fantastic. She left. During the Obama administration, Minneapolis Police Department was reviewed by the Department of Justice. And as a result, they came up with a policy that said you cannot place a person on the ground, face down, handcuffed, as they did with George Floyd. To make matters more interesting, their current chief, Redondo, is Black, and they're still where they are. But more importantly, Chauvin, who was the officer who's now charged, he trained King, who's the Black officer that was one of the other three that was kneeling on George Floyd's back. So to your point, Dr. Lee, here's a guy who was trained by Chauvin. They did not get along. Chauvin extended him twice in the training program. He almost didn't make it. When it came time in the field with a training officer he didn't really care for, he did exactly what everybody else did. Mm-hmm. And so I'm with you. This is a culture change. And I'm one of those former officers that keep saying the community is tired of hearing we need more training. I agree with the supervisor. You've got to codify things, because if there's no consequences, officers will do what they do. And I agree with you both. I want to go to the chat room because we've got a question here, and I'll open it up for everybody on the panel. It's about Measure H. And the question is, can Measure H funding be modified to also be used in helping reimagine police department responses by offsetting costs and personnel as it relates to homelessness, mental health, and addiction? Right now, individual cities have to make spending a priority in order to include field mental health clinicians, homeless outreach providers, etc. And I'll just throw that out to whoever would like to respond. Measure H?
So Measure H, of course. Thank you to the county voters who overwhelmingly passed this to actually tax themselves, quarter-cent sales tax to fund the issue of homelessness. And we, on a good year, we got close to $470 million to fund this issue, this problem, address it. We're going to see a big decrease naturally since COVID-19, when we lost a lot of sales tax revenue. But certainly in the county, we were very specific and had like 47 strategies that we wanted Measure H money to go for. Everything from mental health to prevention, Measure H goes to caseworking and services. The city's HHH goes to building housing. But there was kind of a consensus among our board to not divert Measure H dollars to law enforcement. we thought about it. There's a host team in the sheriff's department that does homeless outreach. But again, why should we have law enforcement be the first responders to those people who are experiencing homelessness? So we can use Measure H dollars for the entire umbrella of the problem. But I think with these new numbers that just came out where it went up, so basically what we're doing is not working. And we need to reimagine those dollars. It is not working. I will say with the pandemic and Project Room Key, we were actually able to move people into motel rooms immediately and provide them services. And that was something that many communities resisted, many elected officials resisted. But under the guise of the pandemic, we're like, we got to get these people off the streets to slow the spread of the virus, particularly those who are older and have underlying conditions. So we need to do more, I think, of that. We need to do more upstream for prevention. And Sherry can really speak to this whole issue. Sherry is a saint. I have worked with her for years on this issue. Her and I partnered together to turn a vacant county building in San Pedro into a 40-bed homeless shelter. And we did it in 6 weeks. And she doesn't know how to say no, and she could probably really speak to where the dollars could be most effective in treating the problem of people with homelessness.
Hey, Sherry, go ahead. Miss Weaver, do we still have you? We must have lost her. Okay, well, I'm going to shift. I'm going to shift back to policing. We've got
I'm here.
Oh, Sherry, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. I first and foremost, just want to, chime in on what Supervisor Hahn said and just thank her too, even for the opportunity to pick, underutilized county property. And as she said, in 6 weeks, we took it, opened 40 beds for single adults. And really what I want to say too is that we're not only addressing homelessness, we're addressing mental illness, we're addressing substance abuse, we're taking care of people's health. It's not just the fact that these people did not have housing, it's so much more than that. And I can say from day one that, we've kept that facility full. And we've even brought their pets in too, which was always a barrier to folks getting off the streets and into housing. But I think when we look at Measure H, I think of homelessness as a multi-layered problem. But I think we've gotten to a place where we really need to look at which one of our strategies is garnering the best results. And I think right now we've every time we come up with, well, what about this? Then we decide to target some money, and we just kind of need to figure out what are 5 or 6 of the most effective strategies, and how do we scale those up to really move people quickly. As the supervisor said, PRK was our reaction to how do we address those that are medically vulnerable and are elderly, so we could, just curb the spread of COVID. And it's been an amazing effort. We oversee one of the sites over in Lomita, and we instantaneously filled those units up. And the thing that we're doing now is we're looking at demobilization. How do we move these folks that are at PRK that are still at risk because we're seeing spikes in COVID? How do we then transition them either to another housing option such as interim housing, or looking at what are some of the long-term permanent resources that we can utilize this for? But I think we need to continue to be nimble and flexible with looking at and addressing, homelessness as it continues to change and evolve through the years that Measure H will be in place.
That's that's Project Room Key for all of you who don't know what PRK. Sherry's so hip. She's all PRK. That's Project Room Key, which was Governor Newsom's project to purchase motels and hotels throughout California and negotiate that to put those who are living on the streets. PRK. That's so hip.
And I live in an acronym world, and I had no idea what it was. So I've got a few more questions here, and for those of you sending questions, thank you, but I do have a couple here that might be most appropriate for the next panel, but I think this one can go into both panels. This one says, our police chief in El Segundo did a white paper several years back, and Chuck, I'd like to toss this one to you, while in Irvine, about implicit bias, effectively showing that group training, i.e. post, will not work for addressing individuals' implicit bias. He says, rather, implicit bias training must be done individually and on a recurring basis. Anybody have any thoughts or any developments there? Is that necessarily true?
Anecdotally, conversations I've had with different trainers in law enforcement, I would agree with that assessment. I think implicit bias is really personal. I think it's best challenged by the community in a non-threatening way, not just some teacher that's talking about it maybe from an academic standpoint, or even if it's more existential. It's more just a training, and most people, just law enforcement officers, if they're told to go, they're just putting the time in. They're you know, geez. So in fairness and in respect, I think it's a challenge that's not going to be overcome by just having another training. Absolutely correct.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we have the public safety leadership program at my center at USC. I'm in the Safe Communities Institute, and we have a session on implicit bias. We have another section on conflict mediation, and it's always an eye-opener. Those officers are very respectful, and I can tell by the body language they're uncomfortable because we try to make them uncomfortable. But I agree that were they there individually, I think that the response and the engagement would be a lot different.
Yes.
Than having a professor in front. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I think it goes back to what Dr. Lee was saying before about the whole thing about use of force and ratting out your partner. If your partner was doing something wrong, it's akin to that. And it's a cultural part of law enforcement. And I think the only way to challenge it is I'm not saying training can help, but I think law enforcement has to be involved in the conversation we're all having. They need to sit at the table and hear the pain of the people in the community. And I'm not sure that's happening at the moment. Maybe the sheriff is, the chief of police is, but the rank and file law officers and sergeants, I think right now they've gathered the wagon trains, they've gathered. They're very defensive. They're very, very defensive.
Circle the wagons.
Circle the wagon. Thank you.
There we
It's
go.
late.
If I can add to that, just because implicit bias as a term,
Please.
comes from psychology, right? It comes from, that's a psychological term. And implicit bias implies something that's very true, which is all human beings are biased. And we are biased by our personal experiences. What we've lived through feels more real to us. And things that we haven't lived through feel more abstract to us. And so because of that lived experience, we are biased towards things that are familiar to us, that we know, that we have competency, that we've kind of lived through. And things that we don't have a reference point for becomes really, really challenging for us to really truly understand at a sort of experiential level. The core difficulty of doing an implicit bias training is that you're actually trying to teach something on an intellectual level and address something that is not particularly intellectual, but is experiential. And so I think this is why it doesn't probably work to do it as a course. It really has to be done, again, also experientially. Outside of let's say the workplace training, how do you overcome biases as a human being? It has to actually be done apples to apples, experience by experience. So it has to be you have to know people in your life that don't, let's say, fit these stereotypes that your implicit bias previously used to. And not just know people, you have to be in relationship with these people, right? So let's give a perfect example. And this is an embarrassing part of my own history. I grew up as a very conservative Christian, and I had very, very bad ideas about people who were gay. And it wasn't until I went to residency and I met all these people, shared an office with, had colleagues that were gay, until I realized that how wrong I was. But it took relationships with people that were gay for me to say, oh my God. And that overcame my implicit bias, not because I read a book or did anything or did a course training. It was because my lived experience changed that. And so I think, this idea of how do we address implicit bias, I don't know any amount of courses taught by an instructor would ever do this, but I really do believe it's possible to overcome implicit bias, but it has to be done through knowing people in your actual life that sort of change your beliefs because your own personal experience has broadened now. And then because your own experience is broadened, then you see other people that you're like, oh, I know someone like that. Oh, they're not like that. That's a stereotype. They're much more complex. They're different and whatever it may be. And so just to address this question, yeah, it does have to be done on an individual basis, but I hopefully also gave some specifics as to how we do that, right?
So what I want to do is we're actually out of time, but I can't let you leave without asking you one more question. And I'm going to start with Ms. Weaver, and then I'll go to Supervisor Hahn. If there were one element of police reform that you could implement tomorrow, what would that be? So Sherry, one element of police reform, what would be at the top of your list?
I think accountability.
Okay. I agree. Supervisor Hahn?
Oh gosh.
I made it difficult on purpose.
I think I would like to see us reimagine who we are recruiting to become police officers.
Okay, and we may have a solution for you for that in about a week out of my center, and so I'll only say stay tuned.
Yeah, because really when you talk about implicit bias or lived experiences, sometimes I think those who have really lived are excluded being police officers. If they have anything in their background that is questionable, we right off the bat exclude them. Maybe we should relook at real people to serve in our policing departments. Just an idea.
Agreed.
Or recruit all women.
Works for me. Chuck, if there were one item of police reform, what would be at the top of your list?
Well, this is a public forum and I'm not allowed to speak that way. No, only kidding. I'd really like to take on the challenge of implicit bias and this whole challenge of helping officers to feel empowered to speak up and do the right thing when they see a fellow officer doing something wrong. Thank you.
And Dr. Lee, if you had that magic wand and you had one item you could implement tomorrow, what would it be?
I would like in every city to invest their resources in creating a parallel department that covers mental health, domestic violence, homelessness, substance abuse as being completely involved in community safety, but completely disconnected from the police.
So with that, on behalf of the South Bay City Council of Governments, I just want to thank this first panel of Supervisor Janice Hahn, Sherry Weaver from Harbor Interfaith, Dr. Joseph Lee, and Chuck Lennon from the County Health Department. Thank you all for your contribution. Thank you for your service, and thank you for having me have an easy job as a moderator. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
We'll resume the next panel at 7 o'clock.
Well, and I would just say, we don't necessarily have to wait till 7 o'clock. We can actually move on that right now. We do have it that way in the agenda. But I want to just bring up something that I did fail to bring up before the first panel. If anybody on the Zoom call has a question, just please put it in the chat area, and Errol will try to use that on top of the questions he is already curated and asking. So some people already did it, but feel free to use the chat area to ask your questions. And then Dr. Southers, go ahead. I think all our panelists are here for the second panel, and we might as well just take advantage of the time.
Okay. Christian, do you want to do the brief introduction of who's on that panel?
Sure. So our second panel tonight is on police practices and policies. Joining us is the Los Angeles County Sheriff, Alex Villanueva. We also have Inglewood Mayor James Butts, who is a former police chief 3 times over. We have Carson Council Member Cedric Hicks, and we also have Redondo Beach Police Chief Keith Kaufman. So welcome, everyone.
Okay. So I can say, gentlemen, thank you for your service and welcome to tonight's panel. And I'm going to open with, I won't be too redundant with regards to some questions we had on the last panel, But I do want to ask, I'll start with Sheriff Villanueva, if I could ask you, sir. You know, we talk about community policing all the time, and, you know, we're here now because of some incidents that have happened over the last several weeks involving race and policing. So how would you define community policing, and what are some of its benefits?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, sir.
All right, we're unmuting each other multiple times. Anyway, I can say this, that community policing is in essence, a shift in culture. And that's a long overdue shift in culture. And I think Connie Rice described it as shifting from the warrior mindset to the guardian mindset. And I will say it's moving from an enforcement approach to an engagement approach, where our successes are not measured by how many people go to jail, by how many relationships we build, how many problems we solve when working with partnership with the community. That is the essence right there of community policing, because we are one and the same. As Sir Robert Peel said in 1850, the people are the police are the people. And the stronger that relationship is then we're going to definitely be successful in dealing with a lot of issues that unfortunately over the decades seem to keep falling in the lap of law enforcement, which really shouldn't be, but it points to lack of capacity from local government in other regards. So we become the default go-to person. And I agree with the previous panel on that issue. However, we're kind of dragged into this go-to. However, always word of caution, sometimes we end up tangentially being involved in something that sounded like something very innocuous, simple at the beginning. Turns out it was something catastrophic that thank God we were there. So it's a double-edged sword. But anyway, that's my definition of community policing.
Okay, I'm going to shift over, if I could, to Councilmember Hicks. Councilmember, you know, how would you define community policing, and what are some of the benefits?
Personally, I did community policing for 10 years in the city of Compton. Community policing to me is being involved with the community, knowing who the players are in your community, having that connection in that neighborhood. When you go outside and you see the officer come down the street, that officer knows that kid on the block. They know the senior that's in the home on the third side of the street. That's the community connection where I think has been remiss over the years, because people have gotten so complacent that they don't want to get involved. You used to go in a community and you would ask a person, well, what crime happened? You know, someone's car got broke into. Oh, well, that was so-and-so, that was his son. No one does it anymore. Everyone is to themselves. No one is willing to give up any information because they are fear of retaliation. And that's what caused community policing to kind of dissipate from what it used to be at some point in time. We need to get back to that. I think now that we have the Black Lives Matters and the other movements that are going on, people are communicating. Dialogue is being shared with each other that has never been shared before. And I think at this point in time, continue that dialogue. Don't allow it to dissipate or disappear, but need to understand, and we've always talked about it here in the city of Carson. And we said, well, no, we're tired of these kids running in the neighborhood. They are terrorizing the community and they're making our community unsafe. We go right back and we have our town hall meetings. These are your kids. They're not our kids. They're your kids. So if you are afraid of your own child, then what do you think the police officer is going to feel? They're fearful of themselves. So you're living in the home with your kids. You're locking yourself in your bedroom, and then you want us to come in here and chastise and deal with your child. But I think the ultimate issue that's really before us is that when, at some point in time, those of us who are of a certain age knew if you got in trouble, your parents took care of it. Now you can't do that anymore. And the first thing that most of these kids do, if you do anything to me, I'm going to call the police on you. And that's what they say to their parents or their guardian. So until that cycle changes and we go back to old school rearing of these children, you're going to continue this vicious cycle over and over again.
Thank you. I'm going to shift over to Mayor Butts. And Mr. Mayor, you know, in the last panel, we talked about what people would do if they could have one item of police reform. And what I heard...
I'm not sure Mayor Butts is on yet.
Oh, okay. Then I'm going to shift to Chief Kaufman. Chief, in the last panel, what seemed to resonate with everyone was the issue of accountability. And so let me ask you, what do you believe are the steps that need to be taken to both restore the confidence of all citizens in institutions of authority and make police accountable to the citizens?
Believe it or not, I think the answer is also in community policing. That's what creates accountability. We have to put our officers, the men and women in law enforcement, continually in front of their community members. And I don't just mean the ones that show up to the town hall meeting. They need to be in front of the actual people in the community early and often, and when there's not a problem. That solves so many of the issues that both these panels have talked about already. When I heard Dr. Lee talk about implicit bias training and how that should be a one-on-one, there's your implicit bias training. The rank and file police officer sitting down with that member of the community on the level, breaking the barrier and talking about real issues. That's how you start to change the mindset of the police officer as well as the mindset of the community member. I think, everyone's definitions of community policing were spot on. The thing that I would always caution everyone to add is that this is also the responsibility of the community as much as it is of the police department. We need an active engagement on both sides. And when that is done and there's a true partnership, that's when the relationships grow and crime is reduced. When I used to teach Coffee with a Cop across America, I had many a police administrator tell me, well, how do you know that this works? What are the metrics? Does crime go down? Do you write more search warrants by talking to community members? Do they call the police more? And I used to always tell them, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, did the line level officer build a relationship with the community member? If the answer is yes, then the program is working. So part of this is our mindset in policing of changing what our metrics for success are. And if we start judging those based on the relationships with our community and the strength of that bond, rather than the number of arrests, we're going to be in a much better place.
And Chief, I'm glad you brought up metrics, because quite often we don't talk about metrics. We don't talk about measuring success or actually determining what's not working. And so let me switch back to Sheriff Villanueva and ask you, what areas of policing do you think are ripe for best practices right now in this time of challenge and turmoil that we're in?
Well, I can say right away, and the chief touched upon that, is the area of evaluations. In our evaluations, personnel evaluations in the past, we literally had a section that said quantity, quality, and they'd go through how many felony arrests, how many misdemeanor arrests, how many citations written. It was very quantitative driven, the whole thing. And somehow obviously the implicit message was the more of these things you do, the better a cop you are. You should have a higher evaluation. Now we're flipping the script. Now on the narrative of the evaluations, I want to see what type of community engagements did you do? How many relationships you built? Or just cite, 2 or 3 specific events and people you met, and what was the outcome? What activities did you engage in, and how did that improve the situation in a specific community? Because now we're looking for a qualitative answer to that. And in it, now the implicit message is you need to build relationships with a community, and that's what we're looking for. And then we have to value that. In the past, we only valued bringing people to jail, and the promotions were designed around rewarding that. Now we're rewarding the promotions and the transfers, the coveted assignments, by how many relationships, how long did you serve the community, and what capacity. The different animal.
So Sheriff, thank you. You answered my next question, because I was going to ask you, are those elements considered for promotional opportunities or selection of special details? And it sounds like you're doing that.
Yes, now to become, for example, to move on to sergeant, you got to give me 4 years in patrol in one location, not hopping around from place to place like in the past, because we didn't value all those relationships we built. Now we're telling him, go out there, build relationships, and we treasure that. And we actually, now we promote people. Sometimes we're going to keep them in a place because we don't want to lose all the relationships built. We want to keep them there. And that's when we're valuing that, and we're moving to deputy to sergeant, sergeant to lieutenant. Captains now have to have a cumulative 10 years of experience on the line, in the field, building relationships at all 3 ranks. And that puts them in a competitive position, where in the past it was just, checking the boxes and, rubbing elbows with all the, the brown nosing events. That's how literally the decisions were made in the past. Now it's like, what value are you to the community?
Right. So, and Jackie, you'll let me know when Mayor Butts joins us, correct? Okay, so before I switch to Councilmember Hicks, Sheriff, I got to tell you, one of the most disappointing times in my career was after my 2 years was up in gangs. They took me out. And I just got to learn who the gangsters were in 2 years. So I know exactly what you're saying. So, Councilmember Hicks, you know, again, I'd like to ask you, what kinds of things should we be looking at with regards to what might be ripe for metrics and promoting community policing?
One of the key components is to, once you get that dialogue in place with the community and know some of the key players in your community, because every neighborhood has a key player in their community, to continue that dialogue, I think at some point in time, bringing them to the table and not just talking at them, but talking with them, because there's some things that need to be addressed. And I think in most communities, and I always talk about this, think of a community that you know is very viable, it's positive, it's doing what it's supposed to do, and then think of those that's not. And those are neighborhoods that you see that there are some issues that needs to be addressed. One being economic, job availability. Other things are service that's not there. So people get frustrated when they can't get the things that's to sustain their livelihood. Then you look at healthcare, and we're looking at healthcare based upon mental health, based upon physical health, and also spiritual health. All of those things come into play if they are not all succinct and working together. The other part that I think that's missing, and I know in certain communities, thinking again about that community that you think is viable and is doing what it's supposed to do, you have communities that have food service, that have proper nutrition and other things, and how that plays into their ability to live in a community. So that's a very important part of it. So I think once you put that community policing in place, because it's a bigger puzzle than just one entity, and I think people don't really look at it as a puzzle, and it's a big puzzle. Once you get all the pieces in place, it should work without any issues, but there are outliners that happen based upon your racial biases and being implicit. And I've always studied Kendi in his What is Anti-Racism and understanding the process within that purview. But if we will want to see a systemic change, we need to start at the source of the problem. I think eliminating violation of people's rights. I understand that the officers are out there. I come from a law enforcement family, for one thing. My father retired. I was in law enforcement for about 10 years. My aunt was in law enforcement in San Bernardino. I have attorneys in the family. All of this plays in, right now my son is getting ready to go into law enforcement. He's on the list. So these are very important key things that I know that are out there, but we need to make sure accountability of all parties are being adhered to. And I think that's what's being remiss, is that real, I think, important piece is the accountability of what goes on. Because if you continue the same road that we've been seeing over the years, and I know in the last panel they talked about the cameras and they talked about all those in place, it's mighty funny, the body cams, that the cell phone became the body cam before the body cam was on any individual officer, but nothing has changed. What's missing is that accountability piece.
Jim Butts is on the line. He's on.
Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Chief Kaufman. And Chief, let me ask you this. Obviously, this is one of the reasons we're here, and we watched the challenges that Minneapolis went through. So how do you handle officers that have, I'll just say, several citizen complaints in their file and hold them accountable at the same time? At what point, if you will, is a tipping point, and when is too much? When is it too much?
Sure. You know, for us, it's a lot easier to do in a department of 95 officers than it would be what Alex has to deal with in a department of 13,000 or 10,000. So we know most of our officers were very familiar with the complaints. Every supervisor that works with the officers familiar with it. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be extra accountability for those that have an excessive amount of citizen complaints, or which is normally the case, and this is what the public may often not know, we generate more complaints internally than we do externally from our citizens, which means that a supervisor has noticed a violation of the policy that turns into an internal investigation where we hold the person accountable. So We do, contrary to popular belief, really police our own, and in some cases much more than an external complaint that would come in. I would second what Cedric said about the body cameras. That is also a level of accountability that every officer has. One of the things that we check in every case of force or every complaint is that the camera was turned on. The technology is not quite there where they all turn on automatically all the time. They do have triggers now, but you have to pay for those. And every time you add a trigger, you decrease battery life. I could go on for hours, but it's really a retraining of the officer to have them hit the button prior to an incident occurring, or even after one had occurred, had they not had the chance to press the button, because they do have an internal DVR, which will go backwards generally about 30 seconds in time and capture what had happened. So that helps, but the key point that we've missed in all of these discussions is strong supervision. Every time I see one of these issues on the news, I always ask myself, where is the sergeant?
Mm-hmm.
We cannot allow our sergeants to become administrators that push paper in an office. They need to be in the field, on the call all the time. It's not about micromanaging. I don't care what, how it's couched. That sergeant needs to lead his people or her people in the field and be on the scene. I disagree with what some of the formal panelists said about the duty to intercede. Happens all the time. And it most often happens when the sergeant with a level head gets their third-party objective and has everyone take a breather. So we really need good police accountability out in the field, and our sergeants are our first line of defense.
Okay, thank you, Chief. So I think I have Mayor Butts with us, and Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us. And so I'm going to switch up here, and I'll let everyone ask this question, but I want to go to the mayor, since he represents the city as well as Mr. Hicks. But as a city, have you communicated your expectations to your officers as to what constitutes reasonable force in situations when a physical confrontation is necessary? Has the city actually told these officers what they should be doing in these situations? And Jackie, do we have him?
He's muted.
Oops.
Okay, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, sir.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so Errol, you and I have known each other for a very long time. The reality is this, I'm situated uniquely amongst probably, I don't know, all mayors. I've been in law enforcement for 37 years. I ran 3 police departments. And so I would be in a very good position to articulate my expectations of the chief and officers. But that's not realistic that everyone can do that. So here's what my job is and what I do. I pick the right police chief. I hold that police chief accountable for the culture that he sets in that organization. And the chief talked about, having sergeants in the field, and it's great to have sergeants in the field. But the reality is it starts so much further before that. In the academy, officers are trained. They're trained in somewhat of a warrior mentality. They're trained that survival is something that should be foremost on your mind all the time. And while the training is broadened out to talk about interactions with communities, when they get in the field, their FTOs re-ingrain this attitude about danger, about knowing exactly where you are at all times, because in case you have to put out a help call, that you'll know where you are to call for help. And this becomes so ingrained in officers that it's counterintuitive to producing someone that's going to be a public servant first and foremost. And so then when you have sergeants that are ingrained in that warrior mentality as well, that treat community policing as though it's a strategy, a tactic, as opposed to a humanistic way to look at your job, then you're always watching people. And if you can't watch people long enough, think about body cameras, what they're for. They're meant to be able to dissect what officers did later when there's a complaint. What they should be is liability avoidance mechanisms. They should only be there to prove that the officer did what was right. But instead, the expectation is they're there to capture what was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so this whole mentality we have about policing goes back so far into what the original purpose of police officers was. It was to create stability in the society where, in this capitalistic system we have, where people could make unlimited amounts of money that neither they nor their heirs could spend in their lifetime. And within a mile, there would be people that didn't make enough money to feed their families. And so to have that, so that you didn't have the law of the jungle, where the people that were faster, stronger, more ruthless, more desperate could take what they wanted, that was the etymology of police.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a system that's born of that, and then you run it forward, I mean, we had warnings. We had the Watts riots in '65. We had the LA riots in '92. There have been riots in Chicago. It's because of the pressure of this society and putting police in the middle of it. And at the same time, hiring people and training people that have racial biases that they're not even aware of. And is it any wonder where we have constant turmoil in this country? So when you say, what do I tell the officers? I don't have to tell them.
Mm-hmm.
I hire the chief. And the chief, I don't hire him for aspirations of doing great things. I hire him for results.
Mm-hmm.
And if the chief doesn't produce results, you fire the chief and you get another one. And the shame of it is that most elected officials do not know what they're looking for in a good chief of police. Most elected officials have no idea how police departments work. And so they end up being held hostage to the people that run their police departments. And that's why we are where we are today.
And it sounds like we need to educate mayors and city councils on the selection process to assess possible chief candidates.
Absolutely, because the chief sets the culture in an organization. You know, I heard a question asked before, how many complaints does someone get before you deal with them? That's not the issue. The issue is, what are the complaints? If they're being late to roll call, that's one thing. If they're doing things like Chauvin was complained about taking a female out of her car in 2007 for driving 10 miles over the speed limit, putting her handcuffed in the back of a police car, and then getting a written reprimand. There's a problem with that organization.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you what they did. They basically sanctioned what he did to everyone that knew about it. And I will tell you this, and the sheriff knows it and the chief knows it. When somebody's an idiot, everybody in the organization knows their behavior. They know what they're capable of. And when they're allowed to do that year after year, Chauvin ended up being an FTO, a field training officer. This was a guy that was training people. So it's so much deeper than you giving your expectations. It's you, the elected body, demanding results.
Mm-hmm. Okay, outstanding. And, you know, you and I have talked about this many times. And in the last panel, we talked about Minneapolis being almost a poster child for police reform, and look where they are. It's just been incredible.
Well, let me spend just a minute on Minneapolis. Okay? Just a minute on Minneapolis. So to go in what I said about the chief had been with the department, I think, since 1989, something like that. He'd run internal affairs. He'd been an operations commander. He sued the department, won $800,000 for discrimination, and he'd been the chief for 2 years. He knew about Chauvin. He knew his tendencies. And don't you find it strange that the next day, with no due process, they were able to fire Chauvin and let him go? So what took so long?
Right, right. Let me go to the sheriff and ask you, sir, what is the county, what's the sheriff's department doing to encourage or require I should say, your department to address the use of force and institutional bias? Is there training that's going on? What kinds of things are you doing in that respect?
Well, we're doing quite a few different things. We do the implicit training already. We do it through the basic academy. We're doing it, we are in the academy, the recruits evaluate each other. And part of that, we get some of these things pop up where people actually, not just implicit, but they're actually explicitly demonstrating some bias that we need to address early on. And they're temporary employees. So we've actually weeded out some of our prospective deputies in the academy through our peer evaluation process, and that's very important. And then we do scenario training in patrol school where we're looking for that issue of implicit bias, where we want to make sure people have a good understanding, legal understanding of what their legal standing is to do enforcement actions. And then with our data systems now, we have our Audits and Accountability Bureau. They have the capacity now to go through all the data that we generate out of traffic stops, all of the enforcement action that we have to enter it into our mobile digital computers now. It generates a lot, reams and reams of data. And just having the capacity to fill in all the blanks when we do a traffic stop is not enough. You have to go back and look at it and see, is there a trend here that is worrisome? Does somehow show some disparate statistical anomaly between the background of the demographics of the community being policed and the enforcement actions? And why does that exist? And that is that actionable knowledge. Are we taking advantage of it and using it as a tool to then pick it apart and find out what's going wrong and why, and then take an administrative action on that information? In the past, it was very passive in nature. We just gathered the data because the legislature says you have to gather this data. But the part was, what do you do with the data once you gather it? And that's the part that was the missing link. Now we've completed that link, and now we're working hard to make it very robust, that we're analyzing the data, and then we take action based on the information.
Excellent, excellent. Chief Kaufman, let me ask you this. And I'm going to ask all of you because it's part of the reason that we're here this evening. What's the racial diversity in Redondo Beach PD, and how important is that to the community that you serve? Does it reflect the community, and if you could just tell me a little bit more about that? Sure.
Yeah, I think it's very important. We actually post our demographics on our website, so we do a comparison of what the department looks like in comparison to the community. We're actually positioned very well here in Redondo Beach, and I don't know the statistics of all of the South Bay agencies, but just from growing up policing here, they appear to be very diverse and representative of their communities. Is it important? Yes, it is, because the officer in the uniform that's building the relationships with the community can really be a leader and a role model, especially for the youth. And it's very, very important. Not all officers will select to put themselves in that particular position where, maybe they're on an assignment where they're not responding to radio calls or whatnot. But key, I believe, in the police organization is creating the vision and the culture that every officer has a community-oriented mindset. And it's not just about this particular unit. When you do that, you create a police department where when the officer should be engaging on the radio call, they end up saying, call the community affairs unit on Monday morning. And that's not where we want to be. We want every officer that way. And I would agree with what Jim Butts said regarding the academies and the pressures, and then the officer coming out on the street. They don't need to be trained with 100% stress all the time, thinking that anything they do could result in their death. Mm-hmm. When I did Coffee with a Cop training across the country, one of the biggest questions I would get was, why do you need to do this? Why do you have to train officers on how to have coffee with someone? And I would say, you'd be surprised. They have the most difficult time talking about something when they don't have an agenda. They're used to, I need license and registration. And that's talking to someone, not talking with them. And we do need to retrain with that respect. And that is a cultural change. And it can be done. It's hard to do. 100% oriented community police department gets pushed back from many, many directions. But the leadership needs to stand up strong, and you need to promote to it, just like the sheriff was saying. We bring our community engagement board into our promotional process, And I want, especially at the higher ranks, I want that lieutenant or captain to know if they think they're going to be promoted in leadership within this police department, then they need to sit in front of the superintendent of schools, and they need to sit in front of someone from the health district, and and someone from our community board. So integrating all these things is very, very important.
So I'm going to go to Councilmember Hicks, and I want to ask you, I have a question here from someone who's on the forum this evening, and it says it's important that the police know what is expected from them, from the citizens of the community as regards to the appropriate use of force in different situations. How can this be accomplished? So in what way, Councilmember Hicks, do the citizens have input with regards to the law enforcement agencies that are policing them?
The ability to have the citizens to dictate the amount of force, I don't think should rely on the people that are being policed. I think that comes by the way of the police officer, and that because of the circumstances are so unique and situations happen, going back, the number one danger that I know that most officers are up against is doing traffic stops. You don't know what's going to happen when you pull that vehicle over. The second one is your 415s, your domestic disputes, when you go into those areas. So those are your two bigger ones because it's emotional, one, and that for an officer to be given handcuffs by saying he can't use force at some point in time would not be policing. But I think the issue is excessive force when it's not warranted. And I think to some degree that might happen based upon fear. And I know that happens on more, because you got to remember, a police officer is human. And people seem to think that they are not human, but they are. So they have emotions as well. When you get in that type of situation, you have to be able to think clear and be able to address the issue when it's put before you. But I think at some point in time that what has been remiss is that connection, like they're doing with the coffee with a cop, to have that community connection. I think most times we look at it as a job. I'm coming into this community, I'm going to police this area, and I get back into my car and I'm going back to my community. So again, that community policing is being part of that neighborhood. And I know in Carson, our Captain Skeen, he's actually done virtual town hall meetings. He's done things that kind of engage the community on different levels since we had COVID-19, but still keeping that connection at some point. We've also instituted the coffee with the cop. He's done that very successfully, and that he's done also town hall meetings, and the elected officials in the city of Carson have piggybacked on when he does his town hall meeting, so that we are supporting what he does in the community to show that we are together as one. And I think that's what needs to continue in other communities that don't show an adversarial connection between our law enforcement, that we're all part of this in the same boat. And to continue that process, it will make it a whole lot easier. But again, just eliminating that process of saying that the oversight is telling the officers what they can and cannot do, I don't think that is going to be a viable process.
Agreed. And I think the way the question is phrased is sort of suggesting that the police should be exercising appropriate use of force. It's interesting. It's written in this way where it says it is important that the police know what is expected from them.
Yeah, that's
from the citizens as to appropriate use of force. But it sounds like there's a conversation that needs to take place. So this person's asking, is there a conversation that takes place between the citizens and the community? Mayor Butts, I know that you've got the community very actively engaged, because I certainly have been there when you've had council meetings, and just talk about that conversation that you have with your city and why it's been so successful.
Well, Sarah, let's back up, because again, with everything, we have this so backwards with police officers. When we talk about having coffee with a cop to teach the police officer to engage with citizens on a non-enforcement level, that is so backwards. You know why you have to do that? Because the entire culture trains them to be an occupying force, particularly in minority neighborhoods. It trains them to be distant. There's all the emphasis on command presence. And I will tell you that I was a patrol officer, field training officer, sergeant. I worked in narcotics. I worked in internal affairs. I was a motorcycle officer. I've commanded narcotics division. I spent 12 years in SWAT. I was shot at 4 times apprehending robbery suspects. And let me tell you something, in all of my 37 years, 18 years as an officer, I never got one complaint. It isn't because I'm Black. It wasn't because I lived in Inglewood. I only lived there for a short period of time. I bought my first house in Carson. It was because I was a human being, because I respected people. I said, I'm dealing with somebody's mother, father, brother, sister. I had an appreciation for what it meant to give somebody a ticket. You know how much grief it puts the average person living paycheck to paycheck to get a traffic citation that the court's going to charge you $350, $400 for, and that this cop gives it to them just because they can. And let me tell you something, they don't give J-Lo a ticket. They don't give Beyonce a ticket. They don't give Katy Perry a ticket. They give her a warning. And here's the problem. You have people that can exercise so much discretion to add misery to people's lives. And we never talk about that in roll call. We never talk about what you're doing when you give somebody a ticket. You know what we talk about? We talk about we have this many burglaries in this area, this many robberies in that area, and I need to say activity in that area. You know what activity means? It means arrests. It means writing citations. It means filling out FI cards, field interrogation cards. It means putting people in cow gangs. And these are all discretionary acts. Do you know what it can do to a young African-American Latino to be put in cow gangs? We got it all backwards. We're trying to reverse engineer police culture, decades of police culture. We bring people into these decades of police culture and we turn them loose to be under the aegis of sergeants and lieutenants and captains that came up in the old way of doing things. Mm-hmm. And so there's the issue. We deconstruct, this is what I've done in every organization I've led. We deconstruct the old police culture and we replace it with a positive culture. Otherwise, you're chasing your tail for good.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to continue with that, Mayor, and thank you very much. And ask the sheriff, what training or preparation did the deputies receive with respect to cultural sensitivity?
Well, there's a lot they receive, and probably the foremost and the most important is that relationship. And I think that all the other people have spoken on this, that influence from the field training officer to the trainee out there in the field. The one from the staff instructor at the academy, the recruit training officer with a trainee in the academy. Those are the two most important influential figures in a deputy's lives, is their DI and their FTO. And how they treat other people is how they see as permissible to treat. And in the and with the FTO, they have a chance, obviously, interacting with the public, whereas the RTO is going to be in the academy in a sterile environment, far removed from the public. But that's the first step, and that's where your trainees start seeing how people use discretion, how they use authority, in what positive ways they can use it, and what negative ways. And unfortunately, there's some bad apples out there that really give a wrong impression about the whole issue about discretion. But the field training officer can be such a wonderful moment, that 6-month program, where they get to interact with the community and teach the young deputies how they're supposed to interact and treat every member of the community as a peer, and talk to them shoulder to shoulder, eye to eye, not above below, that relationship. There should not be a power relationship. It all should be based on how can we get along as a community, how can we work together. And if there's an issue that we need to use some authority, it's because there's really no other alternative. Something really bad happened, we have to take positive police action, you know, a murder or carjacking, whatever the case may be. But, and I agree with the comments made about the traffic citation, the impact of that. I've heard horror stories before of what deputies done because they could do it. And, oh, it makes me cringe thinking about it. But we're changing the culture. We're changing it person by person. And as we move up, as they move up in the ranks, we want to see that they have that track record of being good. How they treat their subordinate staff is also an indication how they were as deputies when they worked in the field with the community. And we have people that I've deliberately have avoided because they have that track record of, just to put it in very scientific terms, they're just an ass of a human being. And we need to really rid the the culture of law enforcement of these people that give such a black eye. And actually it's, you know, one step forward and it's 5 steps back with each one of these characters. And so our training in the field training environment is probably the single most important spot where we had the time to really isolate and see the person one-on-one interacting. We do observation reports and we go from phase to phase in the training process. And hopefully the end result is something that you can trust.
So Chief Kaufman, I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I've had this question twice in the chat box, and there's 2 people have asked about predictive policing, and one comment is that predictive policing is being used to identify problem officers. I've never heard of that, and I don't know if you could speak to that, but do speak to predictive policing. Is it being used, and is it effective?
I am not using it. Our department does not have it. The technology is out there. Departments have had it. It's been controversial in some agencies. There's been lots of talk with predictive policing and the modeling that was happening at LAPD. I'm not familiar with it because we don't have it.
Okay.
But you know, I think that the solution or what I would like to see police departments do across the country is, instead of being reactive to the call for service that's constantly coming out or guessing where the next one's going to be, put time, energy, and resources into the proactive measures that your department can do. Don't just focus on the things you have to do. Focus on some of the things that you can do to be a bit more proactive and get to the root cause of the problems rather than just putting a Band-Aid on. I mean, that's one of the things I learned from policing in my first years in the city of Hawthorne. We were so busy that everything was just a reactive Band-Aid to whatever the issue was at hand, and you never had time to solve problems. And so when you have time, you've got to put your resources within the police department into areas where the officers can help the community solve those problems, because they're unique to every community. We all have different community makeups, but you've got to dive into each one of those to know what it is they are concerned about.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to
Errol, I believe at 7:45 I have to do a Fox program. So,
okay.
So I'm gonna talk about predictive policing, ComStat, and all this other BS.
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, you can't predict where anything's going to happen. You only know that in a neighborhood there have been 5 burglaries in the last month. The suspect came in the same way. So you know that maybe it may be the same person, and that's what you're looking for, and you put resources there. But whenever you start to base discretionary police activity based upon crime that's occurred prevalently in a neighborhood, you know what you do? You criminalize everybody there that you think looks like a suspect. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what you do. And here's something that we don't do. Okay, now I'm the mayor of the city of Inglewood, and I run into some people that really, really give me a hard time. But unless they're like an active criminal, they're my boss. And I treat them like they're my boss. We don't even teach a patrol officer to act like he's dealing with their bosses. If you're not arresting somebody, if you're not taking an enforcement action where you're being resisted, bear in mind, you're dealing with people that are paying your salary. But we don't teach that. And then you do things like ComStat, that basically you have commanders who have pressure on them by their commanders to make stuff happen in these areas, to give you useless statistics. And you know what's behind every one of those statistics? Every ticket you write, every FI you write, every bullshit arrest you make, you're messing with somebody's life. And usually you're messing with the life of somebody you don't care about. Someone that doesn't look like you. And that's the core of what's going on here. And no one talks about this. Everybody talks about changing policy and hiring officers that live in the neighborhood. That's not what it's about. You should hire human beings that treat people like human beings. You should have the culture in an organization that's built on respecting people, that has basic fundamental knowledge of how to be safe, how to do your duties efficiently and effectively. But the orientation has to change from this, we're the sole guardians of the universe and we are so much better than people. There are two movies that people should watch. One is LA 92. It's a documentary by, I forget who makes it. It's outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody should be required to watch that, because what's happened now is you have people in charge of cities who have no idea of what policing is about. And they're so frightened, and they're doing silly things like in Seattle, letting people take over police stations and areas. It's absurd what's going on. As soon as you do something like that, you should resign your position as an elected official. And right now, cities are going to have to hire people that know how to run police organizations, or this is only going to get worse.
Thank you. So I do want to go to one other item, and Mayor, I'm watching the time for you, so you got a couple minutes, but I'm going to go to Councilmember Hicks. We're hearing about defund the police, disband the police, reimagine policing. The recommendations for alternative resources to address those non-traditional crime prevention situations, Councilmember Hicks, would you be supportive of that in policing? Is that something that's viable? Is it something that can be considered?
I would, as a council person, I would never want to defund the police department at any given time. I think that's you're creating a community that's not going to be able to sustain ability to be a safe location to live in. I think if you defunding, then alternatively, you can use the funds to do what other programs? And I've been hearing they want to do social programming and social things in the community. I think the concerns that I see right now are mental health was cut, I think, back in the early 70s, and it's never come back to where it needs to be. You have individuals who have been on drugs, and I say this when I did my community policing in the city of Compton. It was during an epidemic of crack cocaine, PCP, and then meth came into play. These individuals now are grown. At that time, these drug babies, they're grown now. And I always say they might have all their fingers and toes, but mentally are they there? And that's what you're dealing with now in today's society. And I think if you defund the police department, I don't think that's the way it works. There needs to be additional funds made available for other services that need to be shored up because they are being remiss in those communities. But I don't think we should ever defund the police department.
Okay.
You got to do this, and then I got to go.
Okay.
Okay.
Mayor B, are you out?
No, I want to answer this, then I have to go.
Okay, and then I'm going to go to Sheriff Villanueva.
Okay, let me tell you this. Whenever somebody uses a word like defund or reimagine, you know what they're telling you? I don't know what I'm talking about. You're talking about something as serious as public safety. You're talking about reimagine. This is an Alice in Wonderland. And there's one thing I know. I've run 3 police departments, and I know I never had enough police officers. And here's the main thing about policing, okay? There are so many more people than there are police officers at any given time on the street. People follow the law by agreement. And they will only comply with the law if they feel the law is just and it's enforced justly. So anytime someone in a position of authority just says some blanket word like defund or reimagine, they are dangerous to public safety because they're saying, I don't know what to do and I'm scared. And so let's just say something that sounds good. Those are ridiculous concepts. Look at what you have, fix it, make it right, make it better. But you can't just run off and do things like they did in Seattle. You can't just run off and reimagine public safety. Know what you're talking about and do it. If you feel there should be more money put into mental health resources, do it. But don't talk about defunding the police department.
Okay. Mayor Butts, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Sheriff, thank you for your indulgence. Everybody, I'll see you later.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mayor.
All right.
All righty.
Sheriff, I'm going to go to you. And again, with the same question of defund, disband, and more importantly, those recommended alternative resources to handle some of the non-traditional things that are going on. Is that something that we can envision? Is it something that's possible?
Well, I had a press conference at 8 o'clock in the morning regarding the budget for the county. Then they had to participate in the budget deliberations and the vote that the board took. And they took the first step towards defunding law enforcement. And they couched it around, well, the COVID-19 pandemic and a shortage of funds. And then they threw in the care first, jail last, and alternatives to incarceration. And I'm going to echo the mayor's words. Everything is great in theory until that moment when you start withdrawing funds that are needed for public safety. I'd say make something work. If you believe there's something that law enforcement should be doing that someone else could do it, I'd say get someone else to do it. And when they're successful at doing it and they can do it 24/7, God bless them. And that is something less that we need to do. And then we can start having that adult conversation about defunding. But when it's still pie in the sky and there really it's just an animosity towards what public safety or law enforcement represents, well, they're just not being intellectually honest in the conversation, because crime still occurs. People are still being killed, unfortunately. Significant others are still being abused by their spouses, by their boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives. Those things are still going on. Children are still being abused by adults, and people are still being ripped off, burglarized, identity theft. All these things are happening that requires law enforcement intervention. And until we can fix those things, you're not going to take away assets from law enforcement. All you're doing is telling victims, we just don't care. We have this theory, we haven't tested, and we're going to test it at your expense. And I say, no, let's stop that entire idea. If you believe so firmly that something can work, put your money where your mouth is, fund it, make it work, and then we can have that conversation. We're armed with some good data. But right now, we have no data at all. It's just a promise. And that promise doesn't keep people safe.
And I'm so glad to hear you mention data, because often these decisions are made without any metrics or any assessments to determine what we're going to take away, where it's going to go, and who's going to benefit. So those are all good points. Chief Kaufman, I'll ask you the same question. Do you believe that, or do you think that perhaps there could be some alternative resources for some of those non-traditional crime prevention situations that are being addressed by your personnel?
You know, I do. However, I would caution anyone that thinks they can do it to make sure that you don't abandon what current law enforcement is doing, especially law enforcement agencies that are involved in the best practices in policing. There are some models out there. Sherry will tell you, who works with our agency. Mr. Lennon will tell you, who works with our agency on mental health. There are some models that work. Could those be scaled back on the police side and ramped up on the social service side? Absolutely, they could. But I will tell you that the Department of Mental Health is the first one to put forward an MOU that says, if my person's out there, I want them with a police officer all the time. We signed that MOU. So it is very important that we work together collaboratively. There are some practices that are out there that it would really shock people. I testified in front of the County Board of Supervisors about the homeless outreach teams. The sheriff has teams. All of the LA County chiefs of police have regional teams. And over the past 3 years, we have made 27,167 homeless engagement stops. 27,167. It resulted in 29 enforcement actions. I mean, we couldn't stop 167 cars without having 10 enforcement actions. So there's a misnomer that police are only there for enforcement. We have had to change as society has changed. So I would just caution people that talk about defunding and reimagining to remember that police departments involved in the best practices right now, today in 2020, those are the programs that they're going to lose. You defund or try to reimagine Redondo Beach PD, the most vulnerable segments of our society are the ones that are going to pay, because we care about them. We don't want to incarcerate them. We want to help them, but don't just throw law enforcement out without having a solid plan for the future, because this is happening too much. We have seen laws come down from the California State Legislature that are continually written on the backs of our communities, and they're getting tired of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chief. Councilmember Hicks, again, the same question I just asked about defunding and disbanding, and could we use some alternative resources to address some of those non-traditional policing responses?
Definitely. One thing that I would like to stress to other elected officials that are listening, if you have not done so, go on a ride along with your local law enforcement agency. You will be enlightened to what is really going on. I went on the one in Carson and was very, very surprised at the majority of the calls came through mental health issues. It was a continuous process, and that it becomes what the deputies need to really understand and learn what to see out there. Now, as stated by Captain Kaufman, dealing with the homeless, that has been another issue that we've had in surrounding areas of Carson. So again, the mental health seems to be the piece that's missing that I don't think is being trained to the officers or the deputies. And I think that needs to be addressed. And I know there's the psychiatric emergency team, the PET team, there's other organizations that go out, but they also request, because one of the calls I went on requested that the deputies assist with them on a call. When we got there, it really didn't warrant a deputy to be there. It was just they did not feel comfortable going into a home by themselves, and they're supposed to be the emergency team. So even retraining within the mental health organization needs to be done on how they're going to address emergency situations. So it's kind of a round-around, whereas everyone needs to have some additional training because they're not willing to address these issues. Homelessness, to some degree, people who have mental illness, and I said it before, the drug addiction has affected us in so many ways that people are not really aware of how individuals are able to think and act, and that these are residual effects of what has taken place from the 80s, because you think about a person that might have been born in 1980, they're 40 years old today. So you're looking at 40-year-old individuals who were exposed to this drug back when they were born. So again, mental health is really a key component of it. Economic is another part of it, for training to people to know what is available to them so that they can make money for themselves. And all of that creates a person who was frustrated with their life, and they are frustrated with what goes on in the community. And if you see blight, if you see that in your community, that resonates in the family. We talked about domestic violence. All of that is a key component in addressing the individual, and why community policing needs to come into play, and that the resources that need to be addressed are those, and I said it before, financial, jobs, services, healthcare, food, education. All of those are very important to create that entire person as a whole. And I think at some point in time, if you don't have that in place, you're going to continue the same cycle. So I would not defund, again, as I said, but I would look for resources to really address that mental health component.
Excellent. And council member, I have to echo your comments about ride-alongs. I suggest that to everybody I meet who thinks they understand policing because they've seen it on television. In the ride-alongs that I gave in my career, it took about 2 hours before most people would say, I don't know how you do this every day. And it really changes their perspective with regards to what we have to deal with. So gentlemen, I'm going to ask you one more question. I want to thank you ahead of time for a really interesting and I think productive panel, but I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the last panel. We do have to embrace police reform. It is necessary. I agree with the sheriff that was on TV last week from North Carolina. He said, we do have to recite the 6 words. We are a part of the problem. And in saying that, as I talk about police reform, if there were one element of police reform, Sheriff, what would be the one that would be at the top of your list that could help change this cultural paradigm shift that we really need to have with regards to people that don't know how to behave?
Now, you're saying people don't know how to behave within the law enforcement community.
Correct.
There's an entire different universe out there that on the other side of the coin.
Absolutely, as I know well.
Yeah, because in every conflict, there's 2 sides to a conflict, and we're hyper-focused on what law enforcement does. I think we need to have the broader conversation of violence, because we can't condemn violence when it comes from the hands of law enforcement and turn a blind eye to the overall violence in the entire community. That's just not, it doesn't make sense because it's unrealistic. But I think from within my agency, the Sheriff's Department, I think it's the issue of how do we guarantee due process for our employees, at the same time satisfy the needs of transparency of the community. Because sometimes they're at odds with each other, and it's a struggle, because we want to get the information out to satisfy the transparency, but at the same time, we can't violate the due process internally. So we're working hard to achieve both, and that's a struggle that's ongoing, and the legislature is helping in some regard, but that's something that we're working to resolve, and that's where we can definitely reform and take action when we should. Sometimes we delay action too much to the point that the community thinks, you don't care about it, and we're waiting on a decision, but that decision takes 2 years to get to that point. Well, then it's, just as delayed is just as denied, to quote MLK. So we're working on that regard right there.
Okay. Chief Kaufman, if you had that magic wand or one item of police reform that you could put at the top of your list, what would it be?
It would be consistency of best practices mandated by the feds that go across the nation.
Thank you.
Painful things that this process has shown me is that, if you paint the broad brush across all law enforcement agencies based on one thing that you saw, we're failing to realize some of the gains that we've made, and we really need to figure out what those are and put those best practices in place across the country, because what we do in law enforcement affects one another, and usually it's in a negative manner.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilmember Hicks, if there were one item of police reform at the top of your list, sir, what would that be?
Body cams on every officer on the streets.
Okay.
Body cams, and they must be activated, and they cannot be deactivated by an officer.
Excellent. Excellent. So Christian and Jackie, I'm gonna thank the panelists, Councilmember Hicks, Sheriff Villanueva, and Chief Kaufman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. Thank you for your contribution to the panel this evening. And Christian, I'm gonna give it back to you.
Great. I want to thank everybody, including all the panelists, for joining us tonight. As I said in my own town hall, in this one, this is really the start of a conversation, and I would imagine that my colleagues throughout the subregion will want to continue having conversations related to this subject and maybe the broader subjects that are kind of systematically underlying. So with that said, tomorrow Jackie will send out an evaluation form for everybody regarding tonight. Anybody who is interested in continuing this conversation, please stay in direct contact with Jackie and or the chair as of tomorrow, Olivia Valentine, so that we can continue this into the next year of the COG. With that said, thank you everyone for participating this evening, both panelists and everyone that has been listening in. I know we didn't get to all the questions. I do want to point out in the chat area that Natalie did post a link to that film that Mayor Butts mentioned, LA 92. So that is there if you want to grab that now before you sign off. And again, thank you everyone. We'll see you soon. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.